This video examines COVID-19 and American public opinion. We'll take a look at some of the trends of what people were thinking in the US and how these opinions are divided along the lines of, in some cases, age demographic groups, and other cases, not surprisingly, along partisan lines, and compare that a little bit to what we see in some other countries as well. This general overview, we can start with just the idea about how concerned Americans have been about the spread of the coronavirus. And as we see, it wasn't really until we started to get around the point of shutting down businesses and universities around the middle of March when that started to really take off. And not surprisingly, as you take a look at that, you see that there is somewhat of a gap, at least early on, among the different age groups of people who were concerned about the coronavirus and its ultimate spread. So the older you were, the more likely you were to be concerned about this. So at the top, you have the boomers of Generation X. And actually at the present time, or at least from this morning consult's poll, what we see is that at the present point, you see that Generation X is actually a little bit more concerned about it than the boomers are. That's probably somewhere in not statistically significant given only a couple percentage points. Not surprisingly, younger people who were told more or less that they would be less affected, this would be something that would be most serious with older people, were not as concerned about the problem early on in the crisis. But as you see, as we've gotten closer to the present time, pretty much every age gap is kind of narrowed here. And while there is about a 10% difference between Generation X and the Gen Z, we do see that for the most part that gap is closed over the recent couple of weeks. One of the interesting things that we see along these lines is that there does seem to be some differentiation between where you live and your concern about the health risks associated with the coronavirus. So those people that live in urban areas are the ones that are most likely to be concerned about this, and suburban residents least, in the middle somewhere. And then rural residents, for the most part, believe because they're dispersed from a population perspective, that they're least likely to be concerned about this. Now, they're talking about their local economy, not necessarily the entire country, so it is important to be able to make that differentiation. What we have seen so far, at least, is that the worst outbreaks have been in urban areas, such as New York City and in Detroit and some other areas as well. It is gradually moving into more suburban areas, and the trends, as it looks going forward, are now moving towards rural areas. So it will be interesting to see over time how this differentiation changes, if at all. One of the interesting things as we take a look at whether or not people are believing that the government's working well is that we have seen, for the most part, the governors in the United States taking over in the area of dealing with COVID-19 viruses. And many governors, including Pennsylvania's governor, go on television every day for briefings and bring in their health officers and various other officials. In some counties, particularly in the Philadelphia area with the larger counties, those counties actually have some of the county commissioners doing daily briefings as well. What we see is that the highest opinion ratings, more so than what we would consider to be kind of normal politicians, is both for those people that are on the front lines of being doctors and experts in the field. So the CDC has 69% of Americans in the latest poll that was done by NBC and the Wall Street Journal, just released today. 69% of Americans trust the CDC, and 60% Dr. Anthony Fauci. And then governors are the highest elected officials here with 66% versus 36% for Donald Trump and 26% for Joe Biden. Andrew Cuomo has kind of become, in a very interesting way, the Democratic response to President Trump. And you can see here that we don't have the splits on this, but my guess would be that if you took a look at the splits at 46%, overwhelmingly Democrats would say that he was probably doing a good job, and it would be Republicans that would say no. Now, here's kind of a word cloud thing that was asked by Morning Consult about Americans of how they would rank or how certain qualities described America's response to the COVID-19 virus. And as you see at the top, almost about 53% of Americans say that slow describes our response. Not enough being done, disorganized. There are some people, though, that point to positive things: scientific and effective, thoughtful, strategic, efficient. And at the bottom, there are still people that are, generally a lot of people still believe that we're overreacting to this. So about 23% say that, and about 1/3 of Americans say that our reaction has been hysterical. But the biggest thing really is that I think most Americans in this polling data believe that we moved a little bit too slow at the onset of this and could have been a bit faster in our response. Now, here's one of the questions that we often see dividing America, and that is this idea of whether or not we should open the economy up or whether or not we should focus on trying to stop the spread of the coronavirus. And what we'll see here is a couple of different things. One is overwhelmingly, almost all, a good 2/3 of all Americans believe, actually about 3/4 of all Americans believe that we have to focus most on the spread of the coronavirus and stop that. And overall Americans, about 16% say the economy is more important. Now, here's where the splits come in, and we'll see this through most of the data that we take a look at. And that is that there are some pretty strong ideological or political leanings towards this. Democrats here are far more likely than Republicans to believe that we should focus on the spread of the coronavirus as opposed to the economy. So you can see that about 88% of Democrats say spread is most important, whereby about 63% of Republicans say that, and they're more interested in the economy. What's also interesting is that when you take a look at income brackets, and this is not entirely explainable, but when we take a look at this, if you're more wealthy, you're more likely to believe that we should focus on the economy as opposed to people that are less wealthy. But again, in all of these groups, you're seeing between 72, 73, and 75%. So it's not like there are huge differences, but the wealthier are more likely to believe that we should open up the economy. Some interesting things just to throw out. One is whether or not we should be able to criticize President Trump during this period and how President Trump has done. And this is from Pew Research Center from about a week ago. And this is the percentage of people who say it is either acceptable or not acceptable for elected officials to criticize the Trump administration's response. And what we see is that, our belief in the First Amendment and free speech of criticizing elected officials, 2/3 of Americans say that it is acceptable. But what we see is that there are certainly kind of bridges in the gap here where it's about a 50-50 toss-up for Republicans, but for Democrats, 85% believe that it's acceptable to criticize the president. Some other things, basically, was the president too slow or too quick to deal with this problem? About 65% say too slow. People were concerned that we were going to lift all the restrictions too quickly as opposed to not quickly enough. And when we look at this, most Americans are still under the impression that the worst is yet to come, with about 73% saying that. Now, again, taking a look here, this is the brand new Wall Street Journal, New York, NBC News poll that just came out. And we see a little bit more about this reinforced over time. What worries you that we'll move too quickly in loosening restrictions or take too long? And Republicans are much more likely. There's almost a split here of about 45 to 45% on that, whereby Democrats are much more likely to say that the concern is moving too quickly. And independents, again, are more in the middle overall here. Now, a couple of extra demographic things that help us understand this. We know that the Republican versus Democratic concern there is lifting things too quickly. What we see is that women are more concerned than men are about lifting restrictions too quickly. Race isn't as important here, but we do see that African Americans are less concerned about things being removed too quickly. Probably, in some respects because of economics associated with that. And we see at the bottom here that there is somewhat of a distinction, although all the groups in total are at about 2/3. People that are Democrats and are poor are 91% are concerned about restrictions being lifted too quickly. I just want to go back and compare this because there's been some writing about this. That it's not surprising that with a Republican president, that Republicans support President Trump and also believe that he's doing a good job because they're also agreeing with what's coming out of the White House, which is just focused on the economy and trying to reopen the economy. So when we go back to 2014, which was the last time we had a serious outbreak of or concern about public health, it was about Ebola. And what we saw was that early on, as this became a problem, Republicans and Democrats pretty much believed that it was about the same concern about their family being exposed. However, as it became more of a topic of the news, what we saw was that Republicans were much more likely to be concerned about Ebola than Democrats. Now, here's the interesting thing. Remember how we get our news. We get it along partisan lines. Different stories basically highlighted whether or not the Obama administration was doing well or not, depending on your news sources, which made Republicans more concerned. Second of all, people tend to rally around presidents of their own political party. Democrats believe that President Obama would have done a good job or was doing a good job in dealing with Ebola, whereby Republicans were not so likely to think about that. So there is this kind of natural tendency then for there to be partisanship in the way that people identify the job that the president's doing at any given point in time, depending on whether they support that president and the president's political party. And here's some pretty interesting stuff about the coronavirus now and about how people's view changes depending on whether or not they watch conservative news, a mix, or conservative only. And there are three main questions here. The percentage of people who believe that coronavirus is less deadly than or as deadly as the flu. People that only watch conservative media believe, 57% believe that's true, whereby if you only watch liberal media, only 28% believe that that's true. Second question, the media is giving too much attention to this issue. And if you take a look at people that only watch conservative news, 71% say yes. If you watch those people that only watch liberal news sources, 28% and 42% in the middle. And then, not surprisingly, those people who believe Trump is doing an excellent job tend to be those people that are watching conservative media outlets. So 94% of people that watch conservative-only programming believe that Trump's doing an excellent or a good job. And if you're watching liberal programming, only 11% believe that you're doing a good job. And you can take a look here as we go down farther as to whether or not, some of these other things make a differentiation. I'm not going to dwell on them. This is interesting. It's a comparison of either European countries or industrialized nations around the world, and their increase in popularity or decrease as a consequence of this. Oftentimes, what we see in situations in which we have a crisis is people do tend to rally around their leader and unite behind them. And we've seen Australia's Prime Minister Morrison is really the biggest beneficiary of this. If you take a look at his net approval rating back in January 1st, he was at about 24% approval rating. And now he's up above, 75%, which is absolutely amazing. If you take a look at Justin Trudeau in Canada, he's also, his leadership in Canada has been very poised. Angela Merkel done well. Macron in France was absolutely kind of in very bad straits and doesn't look to be all that great right now because France's response has been somewhat off. Prime Minister Modi in India, very high approval ratings. Period. Abe in Japan, not so good. Lopez Obrador lost a couple of points, but pretty much statistically insignificant. And then Donald Trump has actually pulled up about 7 percentage points, although we've seen that tailor off a bit recently. And then Boris Johnson's an interesting case study. So he's gone up about 30%. Now, if you know anything about Prime Minister Boris Johnson of Great Britain, he was really, as far as we know, the only major world figure to have contracted the coronavirus and was hospitalized. And as you see, that kind of rallying effect around a leader when they're in trouble really kind of set partisanship aside, at least for a couple of weeks while he was in the hospital. And you see his approval ratings jumping drastically once it was announced that he had COVID-19 and that he was being hospitalized. And that's kind of a common thing that we see, not only the rally around the president or rally around your leader in times of crisis, but really, we saw this, we've been lucky enough not to have any presidents, be killed or shot in recent years, but we saw this, huge outpouring support for President Reagan when he was shot back in 1981. This is a trend that we typically see. And then finally, I'd like to show one nice quality that is going to come out of this. And this again is from today's Wall Street Journal NBC poll. In looking at how America is responding to the coronavirus, how well does this statement describe your view? This is bringing out the best in America. And if you combined the very well and fairly well, you'll see that that gets us to 71%. So I think you do see a kind of rallying around, being together. We're all in this together, that hashtag, and the American people are willing to do what it takes to be able to move forward and stop this. We'll see how long that kind of holds up, and we are seeing now some political rallies around the country to open up the economy. We'll see how much this gets politicized from here. But this is just a general overview of some of the things in relationship to how Americans feel in public opinion about COVID-19.